Happy Wednesday. We are joined today with a very special guest. We're going to introduce him in just a second, but wanted to say hello to everyone out there. If you are watching as a regular, welcome back. If you are new to Find My Past from Home, we are very happy to have you. As you know, we do these sessions on Wednesdays and Fridays, but be very active in the comments and the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from, what you're working on, and what genealogy discoveries you've made in the last few days. My name is Jen Baldwin. I'm the research specialist for Find My Past. Joining me today is Michael Troy, the host of the American Revolution podcast, which I'm very excited to talk to today. And for those of you who know us, Ellie is in the comments. So don't be shy. Make sure that you're talking to Ellie as well from her office in Scotland. So we already have a couple of people chiming in. William's with us. It's always good to see you, William. Thanks for being here. We're going to jump straight in today because this conversation could probably go for a while. Michael and I were just talking about how long-winded we both can be, so we'll try to keep this under control today. But this is going to be a really, really interesting discussion, I think, and I hope you guys are all prepared for this and ready for it. Michael Troy, as I mentioned, is the host of the American Revolution podcast, which for those of you who have been watching know that I have been listening to regularly for a couple of years now. So this is quite a treat for me. Michael grew up in northern Delaware near the Philadelphia region, near the city. He has had a very long career, studied law and politics, moved into a couple of different roles and moved into IT and is currently CIO for a law firm in Philly that I'm not going to try and pronounce, Mike, because it's maybe Italian in their names. And I know I'll butcher that. In 2015, he started the Unlearned History blog and turned it into a podcast later. And then in 2017, began the American Revolution podcast project. Is currently serving as the president of the American Revolution Roundtable of South Jersey. Mike, welcome to Find My Past from Home.
Hi, Jen. Happy to be here.
Excellent. So we've got lots of people chiming in. Janet's in North Wales. Thank you, Janet. Daphne's in a muggy Somerset, UK. Linda's with us. Roxanne in Utah. Cooper over on the YouTube side, researching into the revolution in North Carolina and Halifax. Tony's over in Iowa. Saying I wish Britain would have won. Plenty of English ancestors. Me too, Tony. Plenty of English in my line as well. Fantastic. So Sherry's in Oregon. Flo's also in Oregon. Megan's in, wow, lots of people in Oregon, actually. Megan's in Central Oregon. So I don't know if you know this, Mike, but every meeting and discussion in Britain starts with a weather report. So what's the weather looking like out in the New Jersey area today?
Yeah, hot and sunny here. It's
hot and sunny.
In the 90s. I don't know what that converts into Celsius, but
gotcha. Yeah. So I do that conversion all the time now. So for those in our UK audience, it's probably around 32 degrees today for Mike. And I'm not quite that hot, but it's a beautiful day in Colorado. So very, very good, nice summer day. All right. So lots of people still chiming in and lots of people from New England and really across the US. So it's great to see folks from California and Jess is in London. That's always good. Gosh, Megan's in Oregon as well. Weather comes at the end of the news, Graham tells us. Okay. All right. So let's just jump into our discussion here. Lots that we could talk about and cover. Of course, this conflict that we refer to as the American Revolution or the Revolutionary War of Independence. Lots of different names across the history books. We're going to talk and kind of engage, but as people are listening, if you have questions or comments or things you particularly want to know about, please do post them in the chat. We'll try to address as many of those as we can. And if not, we'll come back to the chat discussion later and I'll try and address as many as I can from a family history perspective. So let's set the stage a little bit, Mike. It's the mid 1700s. The colonies have just been through the French and Indian War. There's a pretty heavy presence of British military on the continent. Everyone seems to be kind of getting along okay post that initial conflict, but then things start to turn up a little bit. The tensions start to rise. So I really want to talk about this from the perspective, at least initially, of the British soldier, the average British regular. right? The people we would maybe refer to as redcoats. How are they seen on the continent, in the colonies? How are they perceived by the regular person kind of living their day-to-day life? And what is the experience of a British redcoat before the war really breaks out?
Well, traditionally, there were not a whole lot of redcoats, British regulars, in the colonies. Um, when they were here, it was usually to assist with the defense against the French, who were continually contesting for land with the colonists from their bases in Canada and also to the south in New Orleans, places like that. So French basically claimed the entire Mississippi Valley as well as most of Canada. And as the colonies were pushing west, and especially as the French were pushing south from Quebec, we had a lot of conflicts, one of which, as you mentioned, the French and Indian War, which became the 7 Years' War in Europe. The colonists were more than happy to have as many British come as possible to help them uh, stake their claims to Western lands and to control the French from coming in and doing all sorts of horrible things to our good British colonists. Um, as I said, there were not a whole lot. There were probably maybe a little over 1,000 British regulars on the entire North American continent after the war ended in time of peace. In fact, there were probably less than 50,000 British regulars worldwide for the entire empire. The armies were not large like we're used to seeing in the Napoleonic era and beyond of hundreds of thousands or millions of soldiers. It just didn't happen during this era. So there weren't a whole lot of British soldiers in the colonies. And as I said, most of the ones that were either in Quebec because they expected the French in Quebec to eventually rise up at some point and protest British rule, or they were on the frontier to protect colonists from Native Americans. So you didn't see a whole lot. I mean, there was maybe a few hundred regulars in other places, Boston or New York or Charleston. In most cases, though, these were very, very small um, garrisons. Usually, if there was a fort in the area, they would garrison the fort. So they were mostly there to make sure somebody didn't steal the cannons, things like that. They weren't doing a whole lot else. The colonists were usually pretty happy as long as the number stayed small. And the reason they wanted the numbers to stay small was that British law required that they pay for the upkeep of the soldiers, feed them, provide them with candles, with beer, and with lodging. Um, so that all had to come out of colonial taxes, and so they didn't want that to get too big for that reason.
So the taxes at this point, because obviously the taxes are a big reason for us going into conflict in the first place. The taxes at this point are largely supporting the British units that are here in the colonies. I keep saying here as if I'm on the East Coast somewhere. I'm not, but on this continent. It at what point does the tax situation start to get a point of contention, and what's kind of that first movement from Parliament that brings us into that world of tension?
Well, one popular misconception is that the colonies were complaining about high taxes, and they weren't. I mean, nobody likes high taxes, but that wasn't the point of contention. The colonists paid taxes. They paid for the upkeep of the British soldiers that were here. They paid their colonial governments. What they objected to was Parliament levying direct taxes on the colonies. In other words, the colonial governments weren't charging the taxes, it was Parliament levying the taxes. And that was a big concern. First of all, it was kind of a historic protection in Britain that only Parliament could levy taxes on the English people, and the reasoning behind that was, well, the English people elected Parliament, and therefore, if Parliament got out of control and raised taxes too high, they could throw them out of office. Colonists applied that same reasoning here. Well, we elect our colonial legislatures, they tax us. If they raise our taxes too high, we throw them out. If Parliament raises our taxes, there's nothing we can do about it because we don't elect them. So that is a fundamental violation of our rights as Englishmen. So Parliament had never levied direct taxes on the colonies, not because it didn't think it could, but because it wanted the colonies to grow, and it was essentially subsidizing the colonies by paying for a lot of colonial expenses and not charging the colonists anything for it. That all changed after the French and Indian War. There were a lot of debts. Britain didn't really feel the need to subsidize the colonies as much anymore because they didn't want to encourage a whole lot more immigration to the colonies, which were already getting much, much larger than they thought they could handle. So they started to impose direct taxes. And there were a couple of minor import duties they raised, like the sugar tax, but the first really big one was the stamp tax in 1765, which was a direct tax on pretty much anything that was published: newspapers, magazines, playing cards, legal documents, all sorts of things. And this just, the colonists went nuts over it. And there were protests, there were riots. Uh, Mobs in Boston burned down, or didn't burn down several houses, but they destroyed several houses. I made a point of saying they don't burn them because there's really not a good fire department there. And if you burn one house, it's likely to burn the whole city.
Yeah, fire's probably not the weapon of choice, right?
Right. But they did tear down a few, like I think Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's house got completely dismantled and destroyed and things like that. So they took this very seriously. And Parliament reacted very quickly and said, okay, we're going to repeal the stamp tax. It's gone. But then they also passed another act at the same time saying, by the way, we do have the right to tax you. We're just choosing not to because we're nice guys, but we can tax you at any time we want. And so they passed that act at the same time. So that essentially eliminated the immediate crisis, but it also put the colonies on alert to say, they're just going to try this again at some point. We have to really get organized and watch out on what's happening and keep an eye on these guys because we're not sure we completely trust them anymore. And so, of course, when Parliament did pass some taxes a few years later, known as the Townshend Acts, which were mostly tariffs, which they thought would be okay. Colonists said, no, these are not okay for a whole variety of reasons I won't get into today, but if you want to, I talk about it in my podcast in detail. So there was more fighting over those. Eventually, most of those were repealed, except for a nominal tax on tea, because they figured, all right, we're just going to put one little tax in there. It won't be a very high one, but it will establish the precedent that it's okay to tax the colonies. And of course, the colonies said, well, yeah, this is a precedent and we're not going to let you set it. And so they started organizing against tea. And as with anything that happens, there's always a confluence of events and unintended consequences for lots of things. The British East India Company, which imports all the tea that the empire had from China, was having huge problems in India at this time. Actually, it was called Bengal at the time. There was a huge famine there. People were starving to death. And the most important to members of parliament who were stockholders in the East India Company was losing a lot of money. And so Parliament ended up passing a tea act, which would essentially make it much easier and cheaper for the East India Company to sell tea throughout the empire. Up until this time, tea had to be imported into London, then it had to be transshipped through middlemen to various colonies. And the result was that the taxes on a cup of tea were more than 100% of the original cost of the tea. They just taxed the heck out of it.
That's pretty substantial inflation
Right.
there. Yeah.
This Tea Act eliminated most of those taxes, made tea much, much cheaper. So they said, hey, this is a win-win. The colonists are going to get way cheaper tea. We're going to put this really tiny tax on it that they'll hardly even notice, but the overall price is going to go down. We'll get our precedent set, and everybody wins. Well, the colonists, of course, said, no, you're trying to impose this direct tax on us, and it really wasn't about the taxes. Britain could have collected that tax in London from the people who were shipping the tea, and nobody would have cared. But the fact that they wanted to levy the tax in the colony was the sticking point, and it made the colonists reject the tea. Now, a bunch of tea was sent under this new act all at one time to a bunch of different cities. In most cases, the tea was simply turned around and not allowed to be delivered. In Boston, the tea got into the harbor, and the governor there said, once the ship is in the harbor, the tax has to be paid. The ship isn't allowed to leave. And they tried everything to get it to leave, and they couldn't. And the governor kind of thought he had them trapped because after 20 days, I believe, if the tax wasn't paid, they would just seize the tea, sell it, and the tax would be paid out of that money. So they were going to get their taxes one way or another. of course, I always like to analogize it to anyone who has a child. You can make all sorts of plans to how you're going to get them to behave, but they're just going to throw that tantrum in the middle of everything and blow up all your plans. And that's exactly what the colonists did. They jumped on the ships the day before the 20-day period ended and threw all the tea into the harbor so that it couldn't be seized or collected or sold or anything. And that, of course, we know is the Boston Tea Party.
Right. So as you were walking us through that, William actually commented, "Guess this is the Boston Tea Party." So yeah, William, you were just a couple minutes early on that one, but well done.
Yeah.
And Anya saying, "I'd throw a tantrum if I wasn't getting tea." So yeah, that's valid. It's interesting. When I started listening to the podcast, some of this caught my attention right away, and of course on the Findmypast website, we have a really expansive collection of British newspapers. So one of the first things I did, and normal guests and viewers will know this about me, that I love going in and seeing the perspective of these historical events from the eyes of a different country altogether. So the first thing I did, of course, was search the newspapers about the tea and the Boston Tea Party, and learning that all sorts of things about how the British published articles on the American colonists' reaction and trying to produce tea made from corn instead of from tea leaves, kind of as I'm not going to buy this. I'm not going to purchase it as a way of kind of getting through this period of high taxes, and it just surprised consistently on how the people actually reacted to these acts of parliament, how they reacted to the decisions being made in England, and then the sarcasm you see in the British newspapers as they're publishing these stories about these silly colonists trying to fight the British government. So yeah, and Ellie, thanks for reading my mind and sharing that link. We appreciate you always. All right, so here we are. We've got the Boston Tea Party happening, and we have a relatively small contingent of British regulars sitting in the colonies. Things are getting pretty heated. Tensions are rising. Riots are happening. Houses are being destroyed. Demonstrations, political speeches happening on street corners. All of that's kind of happening. How is the British Army now reacting? How are these regulars reacting to the rising tensions? And what is Parliament telling them to do?
Well, yeah, my last answer, I guess, covered about 10 years of colonial history.
Right. Yeah.
Did skip over a lot there. We had the Stamp Act in 65, and then the Tea Party was the very end of 1773. Now, so there was a whole lot happening in between there as far as protests and counter, decisions on how to react to the protests and things like that. And one of the things the British did, especially in response to the riots, which were particularly bad in Boston, even in the 1760s, we had the Stamp Act riots, then we had the Liberty Riot in 1768, which was against customs officials who had seized a ship by the name of Liberty, which is how it gets its name. It's not a riot about liberty, it's a riot about the ship named Liberty, which, by the way, was owned by a guy named John Hancock.
Just some guy.
Yeah. So customs officials were essentially unable to do their job because, they were getting beaten up by mobs, and customs, houses were being shut down, and they just weren't allowing it to happen. So the British government, London, sent soldiers, two regiments of regulars to Boston to quell things and say, settle down, guys. Lawlessness will not be tolerated. And Bostonians absolutely hated it. As I said before, they usually welcomed troops, but these troops were sent as essentially police officers. And the 18th century did not have police forces. People were expected to govern themselves. The people ruled themselves. If they needed law enforcement for some reason, they called out the local militia. So having outsiders come in to enforce the law was seen as tyranny, essentially. And it didn't help that the British government paid its soldiers almost nothing. And so soldiers usually had to go out and find work in the town where they were living to make a little extra money. And they could work for almost nothing because they were getting paid something by the army, including food and shelter. So anything they made was profit. So they tended to undercut a lot of local workers for jobs, which of course never endears you to the local workers. And as we know, Boston folk are never particularly friendly to outsiders to begin with, so it did not create for a good situation. And it led to a lot of tension, a lot of smaller fights, um, and eventually in 1770 resulted in the Boston Massacre, which is essentially where a huge Boston mob surrounded a single soldier who was joined by a few of his comrades, and they just threatened and taunted the soldiers until the soldiers fired on them. Some say they fired by accident, some say it was on purpose. We'll probably never really know the truth, but it ended up with, I don't know, 5 or 6 Bostonians being killed, and the protesters saying, well, see, this is what happens when you send soldiers to try to regulate a free people. This is just unacceptable. And Britain actually backed off a bit at that point, and they put the garrison in on an island. There was a fort in the island on Boston Harbor, so they were kind of out of town and away from immediate contact, but they were, right there if they were needed, but they didn't have to interact with the locals on a day-to-day basis. So there was this hostility between the soldiers and the locals as things were getting tenser and tenser. And it was not just Boston. Boston tended to be the center of this, but we also had the Battle of Golden Hill in New York City about the same time, which was a big fight. The British had brought in some regulars there, and the colonists had erected something called a Liberty Pole, which was basically just a big pole that they rallied around and talked about different things regarding what the British were doing and how their liberties were being invaded. So the British soldiers, being a bunch of young guys who probably had too much to drink every night, would go out and cut down these poles. And so the colonists would keep building bigger and stronger poles with like iron frames around them and everything to prevent them from being cut down. And the British would find a way to drill a hole into it and put gunpowder into it and blow it down anyway. And they blew up like 4 or 5 of these Liberty poles, but it kept getting worse and worse. And at one point, after one pole was knocked down, the colonists demanded these soldiers be arrested. The colonial government wouldn't do it, and they ended up having a huge riot there as well. So we can see tensions getting worse and worse as the years go on.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm monitoring all the comments as well, and Leslie's waiting to hear when Paul Revere enters the story, but I think we've got a minute or two for that. So we've got British regulars out being garrisoned, but tensions are high. So we're getting closer and closer to the official conflict and people actually declaring war. Let's talk about the people for a minute, and move away from the army for just a minute. How are the residents of the 13 colonies reacting to all of this? We have a faction that we know is very enthusiastic about separating or getting close to saying we should separate from Britain, and pushing for war. We certainly have a faction that is saying absolutely we need to be loyal to the king, and just kind of calm down, boys. Let's just do what Parliament tells us to do. But the average day-to-day person just trying to run their life, work their farm, raise their family, there must be, we know there's an incredible amount of conflict, even just in between family members, on this issue, right? This is much more than just a war. It's a social issue. It's a religious issue. It's a political issue. How are kind of the average regular people reacting to all of this? And certainly there's a lot happening in Boston, around Philadelphia, but what about the southern colonies? What about kind of that mid-Atlantic region in a kind of a broader sense, right? That there's all sorts of people out there. What's happening?
Well, uniformly, no one was particularly happy about the policies coming out of London throughout the colonies, because they would just disadvantage the colonies. And we're not just talking about the 13 colonies. There were lots of other colonies. We had Florida, we had colonies in what is today Canada. These were all English colonies, and there was not some huge distinction between them at the time. The distinction came later when 13 of them decided to declare independence. Nobody was particularly happy about British policy, but there was disagreement on what they could do about it. Some said, yeah, sucks, death and taxes, what are you going to do? Others said, no, we really have to take a stand on this. And, we had folks in Virginia like Patrick Henry saying, give me liberty or give me death over this issue. So you had a whole range of viewpoints. Interestingly, nobody in the colonies was talking independence. That was not really a consideration. The consideration was, we've got to have boycotts and protests and maybe even a little violence to get Britain to change its policies. And it had worked before. It worked with the Stamp Act. It worked with other things. If we stamp our feet enough and complain loudly enough and make clear that it's going to be painful economically or otherwise to the British, if they don't change their policies, they'll change their policies. So that was really the hope, that they were going to change the policies. And there were probably different views on exactly how far they should go on to do that.
So yeah, let's just go to a couple of comments. I want to pick up on a couple of things you just said, but let's answer a couple of these. Anya is one of our regular viewers, and not at all a student of American history. How much of America then, during this period, is part of the current United States that we know now? And certainly not all of the states were involved. And you just spoke to this a bit, Mike, in saying that we refer to them as 13 colonies, but they weren't really that yet. So can you just talk through some of the geography for us really quickly?
Sure. Well, nothing really extended beyond the Appalachian Mountains, which, if your viewers know, are kind of Western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, Western Carolinas, that area. So not even the western ends of those states were even very well established. Maybe had a few frontiersmen living out there, but we're really just talking about the area between New Hampshire and Georgia. Maine actually existed. It was part of Massachusetts at the time, but very rare, not very established. Georgia was a fairly new state at the time. It had only been established a few decades earlier. And Florida had only recently been turned over from Spain and literally probably had a few hundred white people living there. It was very lightly populated.
And from the perspective, if you look at a modern day map, just to throw in an additional comment here, areas like West Virginia didn't exist yet. And some of the smaller states in the New England region, as Mike alluded to, hadn't quite figured out their boundaries and borders just yet. So lots of historical maps for this period available online, and certainly plenty of resources to go to if you want to see the geopolitical boundaries. Linda wanted to know just kind of a general sense of the population. How many people are we talking about here?
There are about 2 million people living in America, not counting Native Americans who were not under the government. I think I'm going to say 20-25% of them were African American slaves. So, yeah, I mean those are the general numbers.
Mm-hmm. And Bobby had an interesting comment. Always amazed how much interaction the colonies had with the colonies in the Caribbean, right? So we are looking at, when you talk about this period, you really do need to think about this on kind of a global scale, right? The British Empire is on the rise, and they have territories, dominions, colonies all over the globe. So certainly this conflict focuses on the continent, but there's a lot of interaction with the Caribbean colonies as well, and France and Spain in that region as well.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of specifically British colonies, and like places like Virginia, North Carolina probably had more interaction with Bermuda and Jamaica than they did with New England. There was a lot of interaction between, especially the southern colonies and the Caribbean islands that were under Britain's control.
Yeah, absolutely. So great comments, guys. Keep them all coming. And the chat it is interesting to watch because as you're speaking, the chat goes pretty quiet, which means everybody's paying really close attention, which is always good. Okay. And Wimbledon is happening at the same time, I understand. So lots of people are just trying to do both. I don't know if I could do the American Revolution and Wimbledon simultaneously. All right, so let's get into the battle then, and with our last half of the hour or so, things start to kick off. Obviously, with Lexington and Concord as the first battles. How does the British Army and even Parliament see these engagements? So war has been declared. We're going to go for independence. Continental Congress is developed. People are we're starting to see movement. There's the idea of the Continental Army is starting to form, although I don't think it was referred to in that way just yet. I'm sure you'll correct me if that's incorrect. But what's happening now with the British Army as these battles actually start?
Well, before we get into the battles, real quick, I left off kind of with the Boston Tea Party at the end of 73. 1774, Britain passes the Intolerable Acts, the Coercive Acts, basically a bunch of acts to take away a lot of rights from, especially Massachusetts, because of the Boston Tea Party, and take away a lot of their rights of self-government. They lose the right to hold town meetings. They lose the right to elect their state colonial council and a lot of other positions. This makes the Massachusetts people absolutely nuts. And they also closed Boston Harbor, by the way. There's no trade allowed in or out. Um, and they send a new governor to govern Massachusetts, a military general by the name of Thomas Gage, and he's going to bring law and order to this place and put down this lawless mob once and for all. And he comes in and tries to enforce everything and moves his government out into like the middle of Massachusetts, away from Boston. And he's just going to run things. And he finds out somebody's running a town meeting. He goes, arrests them, throws them in jail. Few hours later, a couple thousand Massachusetts colonists show up with muskets at the jail, release everyone, and then threaten to, his outnumbered regulars as well, to go up against them. Gage realizes right away a show of force is not a good idea here. He ends up retreating into Boston and basically writing lots of letters to London saying, if you think sending 10,000 soldiers is good, send 20,000 because you can't send enough. This is going to be a big, big problem. So things are really getting tense at this point. Gage spends the next year trying to mostly seize cannons and gunpowder and things like that in order to prevent a very angry militia from rising up against him. He's getting calls in London to arrest some of the key leaders. He thinks that will do more harm than good, so he doesn't actually do that. He really focuses on seizing weapons. And he does this a couple times, sending out forces from Boston to go seize things. Um, More often than not, they can't get to it because there's an internal network that makes people aware of this before they can get there. Paul Revere is a big part of that internal network. Um, in early 1775, he hears that there's a bunch of cannons out at Concord, sends a unit out to go take those. Along the way, they come across some militia who are standing up against them at Lexington. Not a lot, a few dozen men. Um, by all accounts, they tried to disperse when the British told them to disperse. We're talking about many hundreds of British soldiers on this mission. They get shot down. The alarm goes out to everyone that the British are killing colonists. The colonists all turn out, start firing on the British from all over the place. The British make it out to Concord and make it back to Boston, but just barely. Gage has to actually send out reinforcements to help them get back. They're battered. They lose hundreds of soldiers along the way. It's a real mess. War is on. This is April of 1775. Um, the Continental Congress had first met in 1774, and basically they were trying to respond to the coercive acts at the time. They basically just passed a bunch of petitions to the king and said, please change all this. There was a lot of hope among the colonists. They kind of knew the king supported Parliament, but they kind of thought once this fuss grew big enough, the king would kind of say, "Oh, I'm shocked that Parliament's doing all these horrible things. I'll be the peacemaker." So they sent these petitions hoping that would happen, and then they agreed to meet the next year to follow up after they gotten some responses back from London. The king, of course, said no, sent lots of British soldiers to back up Parliament's position, and we'd actually gone to war by the time the Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775. When they met, there was a huge army, the Army of New England, surrounding Boston, keeping the regulars in there under siege, and they could not leave the city at all, or they would be shot. Um, the New Englanders had also by this time went out and seized Fort Ticonderoga in New York. So they were actually going out and offensively taking British forts. The Continental Congress wasn't really sure what to do about all this. They're like, oh my God, there's a war. Now what do we do? They really had no idea they could ever beat Britain. And so they weren't quite sure what to do, but they ended up saying, well, we got to take control of all this. We will create a continental army to take over for the New England army, and we will put George Washington in command of that army because he's not a New Englander. That'll help bring the rest of the colonies into this whole thing. And so By July of 1775, George Washington was in Boston, or the area around Boston at least, with forming his Continental Army. Now, of course, even before that happened, in June, the British tried to take Bunker Hill, which they did, but at a huge cost, lost about 1,000 men doing so. So we have the Continental Army, and now we have full-scale war going on. Now, from a British perspective, they thought, well, this is really going to be the end of it because colonists can't defend themselves. A professional army will always defeat a militia. And there was good reason for believing this. At the time, basically the way you went to war was your men had to stand shoulder to shoulder in a field and fire at each other, and the first one that flinched and ran away was the loser. And obviously, untrained, basically civilians are going to be the first ones that flinch and run away. So they thought, no problem. And you read all these letters from generals at the time saying, "Give me 5,000 men, and I will subdue the entire continent without a problem." And this wasn't just bluster; they really believed they could do this. The attitude of British officers and soldiers was that militia can never stand up to regulars. We have regulars; they don't. This is going to be an easy win.
Yeah, and I think that the mental image that forms when you talk about this period in the podcast is very much these kind of bedraggled individuals in kind of rags almost with pitchforks and throwing rocks at British regulars. And then you have this very clean, formal army standing on the other side in their, in their very, polished uniforms, wool heavy uniforms with full weapons. And how could you possibly think that this little militia is going to beat, at this time, the world's greatest army? And this becomes this, I think one of the things that stands out for me is this is the largest force, eventually becomes the largest force that Britain has ever sent overseas into an engagement at this point. In Britain's history, rather. So you have this massive army. Some of those letters get responded to, and they send more soldiers eventually, which in and of itself is a huge undertaking to send this huge army across the ocean to fight these little rebels. So the attitude of the generals, the admirals for the Royal Navy, the Parliament, people back in England must have been just one of almost, gosh, we're better than this. We could definitely beat these guys. But at the same time, there's got to be a point where that confusion hits and they go, how come we haven't won this yet? Like, why is this still happening? Because we've sent all of these resources over to these colonies and they're still kind of messing around over there. It's just such an interesting dynamic, I think, to the whole period of history.
Yeah, well, the British decided in 1776, we're just going to put this down once and for all. We're going to send the largest fleet over there we can. As I said, during peacetime, the entire British Army, empire-wide, was about 50,000 people. Well, they sent 50,000 soldiers and sailors to New York City alone, and they had probably another 10,000 soldiers and sailors up in Canada at this time. So this is really an all-out effort. And as you said, getting soldiers across the ocean at this time was very difficult and very expensive. I read one statistic where 11% of all British soldiers died on the trip to or from America. I mean, it was that much of a difficult journey. They send this huge number over. They expect they're going to be able to capture the Americans very quickly. They're all going to back down. And in fact, the two leaders they sent to do this, General Howe and Admiral Howe, who were brothers, were also made peace commissioners because they figure we're going to get over there with a huge show of force. The Americans are going to say, all right, we realize the British are serious about this. There's no way we can defeat them. Let's ask for terms and put this thing behind us. And the British were pretty effective at defeating the Americans. They pushed them out of New York. They pushed them out of New Jersey. They did not succeed in actually capturing most of the Continental Army, which they probably should have done. And a lot of people really blame General Howe for not doing this and point to the fact that General Howe actually had a lot of sympathies with the Americans. And so there's a lot of question of whether he just didn't want to capture them because it might have been a bloodbath or he actually sympathized with the American cause. For whatever reason, they didn't capture them, but they did capture New York and New Jersey. And as peace commissioners, they basically sent out pardons to anybody who wanted one, just swear your loyalty to the king and all will be forgiven and we'll get back to normal. And that really seemed to be taking effect in the months following their invasion. And the only thing that changed that was when George Washington finally managed to cobble together a few hundred soldiers, cross over the Delaware, and capture an outpost at Trenton that was manned primarily by Hessians who were fighting for the British. And they ended up taking back most of New Jersey in the next few weeks. And that's what really, if they hadn't done that, the war probably would have been over.
Yeah, the infamous crossing of the Delaware, right?
Yeah.
I guess not infamous, actually, just famous in general.
Infamous in Britain. Famous here.
Yeah, true. Yeah. So a couple of questions coming in. So let's pop a couple of these on the screen, and we'll kind of
Sure.
come back to this dialogue if we get the opportunity. But Janine wants to know, any thoughts on how many of the British troops were indentured?
I don't think British soldiers were indentured. They were paid to join the military, and paid a cash bounty for signing up, and then paid to be a member. But you couldn't just leave the army either. Usually, if you were an enlisted man, you were enlisted for life, unless there was some decision to let you go.
Yeah, and Janine, from my perspective, there are some resources for indentured individuals. Findmypast actually has a couple of collections on the site, but again, just to reinforce, they are not members of the army. They're just people who arrived to the New World as indentured laborers. But you can find some records of them.
A lot of people who came to America came as indentured servants because the journey to America was expensive for most commoners. So you agreed to work for anywhere from 3 to 7 years to pay your wages, pay for coming over.
Yeah. Roxanne wants to know, how would one go about finding or confirming loyalists in our family history?
Well, that can be difficult. Unless they were really outspoken loyalists who ended up leaving the country. Most of the people who had loyalist sympathies tended to keep quiet during the war, and certainly after the war, because it wasn't a popular thing to be. There are some, for more of the outspoken loyalists who were maybe banished or something, they filed records, I believe, with the British government seeking compensation for their losses, things like that. Other than that, there may have been accusations or trials against them. A lot of colonies put out lists of accused loyalists, and if you were on that list, you were likely going to have all your property seized and possibly be thrown into prison as well.
There's a handful of resources available too, from a family history perspective on this, Roxanne. Obviously, as with any family history case, you want to build as much evidence as possible. Because, and what Michael, I think, is alluding to and leading to is, there's a lot of reasons why someone might have declared themselves a loyalist or a patriot. And they may have done that, they might have been a loyalist at 9 a.m. and a patriot by 4 p.m, depending on who was in charge in their area at the time and what was happening around them politically and militarily, right? So there's a lot of variations for kind of the average person kind of living through this conflict. But similar to the Patriot cause, we have the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is a lineage society that traces people who descend from people who declared their loyalty to the American cause. There are similar organizations for loyalists as well. Most of them are based in Canada. So that's a great way to start. If you know the person in your family tree that was around the colonies during this time frame, check some of those kind of standardized resources to see if you can find their name on a list. But just because their name is on the list doesn't mean that's actually how they felt or believed to themselves, right? They may have very much kept their personal opinions quiet throughout their lifetime.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I mentioned the British taking New Jersey a few minutes ago. A lot of New Jerseyans signed oaths of allegiance. And a few weeks later, when Washington took the area back, they basically said, "I take it back. I didn't mean it." So
Yeah, exactly. And that's a perfect segue actually for me. So thanks. Find My Past is getting ready to publish some new records. As you guys know, we publish new records every week. So Friday will be a big day for this particular period of history. We will be releasing some information around the Pennsylvania area on this topic. And some of those oaths of allegiance will be going on to the site for Pennsylvania. But again, just because they sign that doesn't mean, and in this case, they're oaths to the government of Pennsylvania, it doesn't mean that they were actually loyal patriots and wanted their own country and wanted independence. It may just mean that that was the politically savvy thing to do in the moment. So, take all of that with a bit of grain of salt, Roxanne. And again, just like any other genealogical project, the more information and resources you have, not just on your ancestor, but the community they lived in, the battles that were being fought around them, the politics, the religion of the time, all of those facets go into play. And you've heard me say it before, guys, fan research, friends, associates, and neighbors. You really have to follow that methodology to try and get a sense of what your ancestor really believed.
yeah, Britain captured Philadelphia in 1777 and held it until spring of 78. And during that time, a lot of people in Pennsylvania signed oaths of allegiance because they would have been taken prisoner otherwise.
Right.
So you see a lot of oaths of allegiance. And then when they left in 78, again, you see people taking that back and trying to get out of it. And those that didn't had to flee, basically. They went to followed the British back to New York, or they went to Canada.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So a great question from William. I like this one. This is kind of one of those what if questions. If it had gone the other way, do you think there'd be a big difference today?
And that's a big question. It's really hard to say. A lot of people would say we probably have evolved a lot like Canada did because they're the alternative to independence. Um, it's unclear that the U.S. would have grown as quickly as it did because we got a lot of immigration from other countries once we became independent. So we probably wouldn't have grown at the speed that we did had we remained British colonies, which probably meant that France might have maintained a foothold in this continent in Louisiana, and Spain very well might have held on to most of what is today the Western United States, and Russia could have held Alaska. So it's unclear whether if the U.S. hadn't expanded as fast as it did, that those other European powers would have had to give up as much as they did, as quickly as they did. I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. would have become independent at some point. We were just growing to be so much larger than Britain. And Britain was never going to give us proportional representation in Parliament because they would have become a minority in their own government and they wouldn't have tolerated that. So I think independence at some level was inevitable, much like happened with Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. So you guys, these are great questions. So keep them coming. Thank you. Anya wants to know, was the war limited to just those with a British link, or were there others on the continent at the time that were involved, other settlers or from the native population? That's another big question.
Yeah, I mean, there were natives involved in the war on both sides. There were very many colonists who were from other countries. There were a lot of Dutch in New York, most of whom supported the Patriot cause. There were a lot of German colonists in Pennsylvania and in Western Maryland and Virginia, which is where my ancestors come from, by the way. These were all German-speaking people who had come from German states and settled in the colonies decades before independence. So they were all there. Many of them fought on both sides of the war as well. So yeah, and there were a lot of Scots in the South that fought. So yeah.
Yeah, people from all over. Bev, thank you for sharing the link to the United Empire Loyalists. I appreciate that. I did not have it handy, but for those asking or wondering about resources on the Loyalists and your ancestors, that's a great place to start. Lloyd just has a comment here. My mom's side, we're all Loyalists, but have several DARs as well, Daughters of the American Revolution ancestors, including a chapter in Kansas named for Desire Toby Sears, called the Mother of All Patriots. I don't know if you have any stories or know anything about her for a quick comment, Mike.
No, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with her. But yeah, there's lots of people that can trace their ancestors to both sides because there were quite literally families who fought on both sides of this thing.
Yeah, and I'm one of them actually. I am a DAR and United Empire, or working on United Empire. I haven't actually applied yet. All right. Let's see. I'm just going to scroll through these comments really quick and make sure I got everything. So this is kind of just an interesting little story to share. Don saying, my 4 times great grandfather, John Collison, was a drummer. Still can't confirm if born in Ireland or England. Every tree has England, but one Loyalist document has an I for where born. A little bit more work to do there, Don. Sounds like an interesting situation, though. All right, good. Thanks very much, everybody. And keep the questions coming. As I see more, we'll pop them up. But we do have a few minutes left. So let's talk a little bit about kind of change tactics here. If we want to talk a little bit about the British soldier experience, what we started with, I want to go back to that a bit. We've already mentioned a bit, they're in heavy wool uniforms. There are lots of them now on the colony, in the colonies, kind of fighting these battles, facing against the Continental Army as the war progresses. But most men didn't die during battle, right? They died due to other causes, illness, and a climate they're unaccustomed to. So can you talk to us a little bit of just day-to-day camp life?
Yeah, well, conditions in the 18th century are miserable by today's standards, by any circumstances, but especially if you're a soldier in the field. You're very cold in the winter, you're very hot in the summer. Um, An interesting fact about shoes at the time, they didn't make right shoes and left shoes. They made them both the same. And if you wore one long enough so that it began to shape to your foot, your officers would make you switch your shoes to the other side to keep them symmetrical. So you're marching around, tens of miles a day in uncomfortable shoes, wearing a heavy wool coat, carrying, tens of pounds of equipment. So yeah, not a fun situation. A great many soldiers would die of, say, heat prostration during the summer. Probably 20,000 died of disease, as opposed to maybe 4,000 or 5,000 battle deaths during the course of the war. So yeah, disease was a huge killer of people on both sides. So yeah, it was a tough experience, and British soldiers probably did better than the Americans for a lot of reasons, mostly because the British were a lot better getting food and supplies to their soldiers than the Americans were. But it was still very tough going. A lot of times they would end up having to go on like half rations or things like that for months at a time, and it was a pretty tough experience.
Those are pretty incredible numbers. 20,000 illness deaths compared to 4,000 or 5,000 from battles. I think that's something to really call attention to. I wouldn't think that most people would kind of recognize that kind of discrepancy.
Yeah, a lot of times you'll hear about soldiers being eager to get into battle, and you think, oh, these are really brave guys. No, they were thinking, well, if we have a battle, this war might end soon. We have a better chance of living through this
Survival
than
rate.
sitting in camp for a year where half of us are going to die from dysentery and smallpox.
Yeah. Very, very well said. Very good point. So the food rations, the weather, the climate, resources. How is the Continental Army facing up against all this? We know that their resources were much more limited than the British. So how are they pursuing those opportunities? Where are they getting food?
Anywhere they could, really. I mean, you had a whole bunch of problems. I mean, the British were able to come in and they would pay gold and silver to the locals to get what they needed, and that was always accepted. Regardless of your ideology, you take the money because you needed it. The Continentals had no money, and they would pass out Continental dollars, which were basically paper notes saying, someday, we're not saying exactly when, but someday you might be able to exchange this for real money. So yeah, people were not crazy about taking that, because obviously if the Continentals had lost, they never would have paid that off. And if the Continentals had won, they still might never have paid it off because they had no way of collecting taxes. So yeah, a lot of people didn't want to accept this paper money. Um, uh, Continentals often had to seize food almost at gunpoint. They didn't want to risk alienating the locals, but at some points they just had no choice and had to do this. But yeah, a lot of starvation. I mean, we had people at Valley Forge who literally were dying from starvation.
Yeah. So with our last few minutes, and Carolyn commented, and perfect timing, Carolyn, thank you for that. Can you recommend an easy read book about the revolution? And then I'll follow up with just what are your favorite resources? We were chatting before we started, and my own personal library has grown considerably listening to this podcast. I blame Mike completely. And my husband always says, something about another book. I'm like, it's his fault. It's not me. He made me do it. So what are your favorite suggestions for someone either just diving into this period or some of us who are a little bit more studious and have been reading about it for a while?
One that just came out, which I've read a few months ago, was Liberty is Sweet by Woody Holton, which is kind of a good overview of the war itself, but it differentiates itself from some of the more traditional ones by focusing a little bit more on the roles of women and minorities in the war, particularly slaves and newly freedmen, things like that. So that was an interesting one. For any of you who want things from maybe a British perspective, um, Rebels and Redcoats by Christopher Hibbert is an interesting one. Don Hagest has written a number specifically on British soldiers, noble volunteers and distinguished corps, which, if you're interested in learning more about the day-to-day life of a British soldier, those are good ones to go with.
Fantastic. And I am like writing all those down myself. It's good. All right. So last couple of minutes here. Lloyd wants to just give you a little comment. Loved your response to the what if question. Very thoughtful. So thank you for that. Excellent. Any last kind of last comments? What are the things that we really need to know about the Loyalist experience, the British Army experience? As genealogists, do you have any little words of wisdom to leave us with?
Well, I will say this was it was a civil war. It was a war that we fell into, and both sides didn't really regard the other side as enemies for much of the war. Obviously, if you're shooting at them, you're shooting back. But we kind of saw this as an internal affair. Even after declaring independence, a lot of people in Britain sympathized with the American cause, thought the colonists had been getting a raw deal. And of course, we know that a lot of colonists were loyalists who said that regardless of what Britain is doing to us, we are the king's subjects and have to remain loyal. So there really was a lot of internal emotional debate about how far we should take this. Should we really break? Should we really do all these things? And you read that in a lot of the letters that you see, especially family members. I mean, Benjamin Franklin's own son was a leading loyalist. And then that situation was not unique. I can tell you about Revolutionary War generals who had brothers who were officers on the other side. Happened all the time that families just divided over this issue. And so the breakup of the empire was very hard on individual families as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Gosh, every time you say something, I have more questions, but I do have to pull myself in here. So, guys, if you're interested in this period, I can't recommend the podcast enough. I've learned a ton, and even if you just listen to it occasionally, it's well worth it. You get little snippets of history. We've shared the links in the chat, but we will share them again. So please do follow that. If you're not a podcaster, just take a look at Mike's blog. It is essentially rough transcripts of the podcast. Lots of resources are shared, maps and images and historical documents. And he's really good at making sure that he shares things that are accessible to a lot of people, right? So sources like Internet Archive and other sites that we're very familiar with as genealogists. So thank you very much, Mike. But please do, everybody, follow him on his social media links as well. I know he's got a very active Twitter thread and a Facebook group and then the podcast as well. So thanks for being with us. We really appreciate your time. And we'll close it out for the day. We'll be back, of course, on Friday for everybody with our Find My Past from home sessions. Of course, it's Find My Past Friday with new records. And this week's host is me. So you get a double dose of Jen this week. Good luck with that, everybody. All right. So thanks very much for being with us, and we will see you all on Friday. Have a great day.
Thanks.